Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Crysler. Each episode, we talk to business leaders and subject matter experts to learn about the challenges they've overcome and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. Hey everybody, so excited to be welcoming Angela Thurman back to the podcast today. Angela is a certified project management professional as well as the founder and CEO of Thurman Co, a management consulting firm based out of Houston, Texas. Angela, thanks so much for coming on the Everyday Business Problems podcast.
Thanks, Dave. I'm glad to be back.
Yeah, always excited to chat with you. We always have a fantastic conversation, and you're just always a wealth of information and insight. So excited to have you on today and unpack the complex topic of digital transformation and the impact of project management on digital transformation. So excited to welcome you back to the show.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the best place to start with this is the recent blog article that you published. What tremendous timing that we had when we were setting this podcast recording up. But the blog title is The Differences Between Digitization, Digitalization, and Digital Transformation. So help us understand these three terms. It's such a great place to start unpacking this conversation.
Sure. So digitization is the conversion of existing analog information into a digital format. So think about, scanning old paper documents into a digital format. That would be one form of digitization. So when we think about maybe converting analog music into an MP3 file or digital mapping. So when satellites are mapping the surface of the earth, and think about, Google Maps, for example, that is a perfect example of digitization of existing analog information. All of those are great examples. And I'm sure you could think of 100 more examples. I think about the conversion. I always tell people digital transformation is not new and began, even way back when we started taking and converting the analog information that was in the old accounting ledgers, and we began to put it into digital format in a spreadsheet. Remember Lotus 123? Yeah. That was digital transformation. So we converted that analog information that was in a ledger, a book, and put it into a digital format. That was digitization. Digitalization then further leverages that digitized data. So good example of this might be your smart home technology. So we've got this the integration of the Internet of Things and how we can use that, all of that now available digital information, that data, and how can we further leverage that? Smart factories, online banking, telemedicine, even what we're doing right now with this podcast interview. We're using a digital format to conduct this interview. So this is digitalization of the digital data that was available. Digital transformation, though, then begins to incorporate both digitization and digitalization to extend the reach of that data and incorporate processes to just fundamentally restructure an organization and their strategies, cultures, customer engagement, pardon me, the manufacturing process to advance the organization further and improve their processes, their efficiencies, and so forth. So we think about transportation, mobility, Industry 4.0 in manufacturing, and this is really where smart manufacturing comes into play. We think about ERP systems. That could be a digital transformation. All types of streaming services and media. The applications to share knowledge and to share resources. The things like Teams and Zoom, where we can actually collaborate in real time from diverse geographic areas. That can be a digital transformation. We're no longer chained to a physical presence to be able to collaborate. And I really think about ERP systems a lot when I think about digital transformation, because we're able to share in real time the information throughout the entire organization, and we see the impact of sales forecasting, inventory controls, change management, engineering design changes, and so forth, and all the ripples throughout the organization in one system, hopefully one integrated digital system. So those are just some ideas around the digitalization, and digital transformation.
I mean, what an incredible way to kick off the conversation and unpack those differences. Again, before we got started here, I know that we chatted through, these are terms that often get bucketed simply by digital transformation. So it's great to unpack this and have a real terminology for what's happening throughout our organizations, because again, it means different things to different people depending on the level of system maturity they've already achieved within their organization. So again, terminology is difficult for a lot of organizations to kind of adopt holistically. So I always love starting to unpack complex things by saying, what does this really mean, to me? Does it mean the same thing to you? Are we talking about the same thing? Okay, great. We are. All right. Now let's move on to the next part. So yeah, really, really amazing, Angela. I love that. And definitely going to make some great clips coming out of that. So shifting over to, project management and kind of the role that it plays or how it contributes to the success of kind of each one of these different levels of maturity, what would you say from that perspective? Because I think a lot of people take a look at the work that PMs do and maybe it gets a bit overlooked in terms of the significance and the value that it could bring into some sort of, holistic change like this. So let's talk about that a little bit, what you've seen from your perspective being a PM and, having to kind of fight to say, hey, we have real value, in these changes.
Well, if I think about digitization, and converting that analog information into a digital format. That can come, there are so many different examples. So the summer before my senior year of college, I worked at a law firm and for part of the summer. And this was way back in the dark ages. And the law firm that I was at was one of the cases that we had was for a class action lawsuit. And we represented the dairy farmers in Northwest Arkansas. And the feed that had been purchased by the dairy farmers had been contaminated with a product called peptide. And as a result, the milk produced at these farms was also unfit, it was contaminated, unfit for human consumption. So imagine how devastating this would be for the farmers to have to milk their cows every day and literally dump the milk. It was unfit. So as a result, many of the farmers had to declare bankruptcy, and then they were seeking compensation through this lawsuit or this class action lawsuit. And so one of my jobs as a temporary, I was like an interim secretary at this lawsuit, is I literally had to scan the check registers of all of these farmers. And so I was digitizing that analog information for the records of the attorneys. So I didn't even know what digitization was at that point, and I was just an engineering student and working for this lawsuit. But that is an example, And so imagine you're being at the copy of our scanning check registers all of these farms, and what an uncomfortable and tragic experience that was. But it ultimately was for the greater good. So a project manager, if I had been the project manager of this class action lawsuit, right, that would have been a task assigned in the project plan. And I would have probably, so here's the resource, Angela's going to be the person to do that. I would have assigned a duration for that, and would have tracked, was it done? I probably would have assigned multiple tasks. So, farmer A, farmer B, farmer C, and tracked the completion of these tasks in my overall project plan for this lawsuit. Now, I don't imagine that anyone at the law firm was thinking in the terms of project plans, but that's the way that I, as a project manager, would have approached this. So, for that's just one example. If I think about a digital transformation, which I've been a part of many digital transformation projects, I would have a project plan. And there would be things like, what is the objective of this digital transformation? What a change is going to occur. And as a project manager, my life depends on change. There wouldn't be a project but for the fact that some sort of change is going to occur. So, identifying the stakeholders, who is going to be affected by this change? How are they going to be affected by this change? And I would want to get their involvement, their responses, get their requests as far as how they want to be contacted and communicated with, and make a note of that as well. Because if you're in a digital transformation, there are likely to be some people who are in opposition to the change. There are always people who are opposed to change. They like the way things are. It's always worked. Let's just keep doing it the way we are. But with the change in a digital transformation, you need to identify who is affected and how they are affected. And then another thing to think about is, the timing of this. What is going to be the most efficient way to implement the change so that it doesn't negatively impact your stakeholders? Now, you can't always please everybody, but try to please as many people as you can, while not having a negative impact. You don't want to cause a disaster in one department just to please 10 other departments. So, you want to try and build a schedule that will meet the objectives of the organization as well, and just try to mitigate any risks and identify those risks, get the feedback from your team and your stakeholders about what risk might occur, and plan for those risks. So those are just some like the things that immediately come to mind. And now
there's a whole host of things to unpack with that. But I mean, kind of, segued right into my next question. And this is a topic that, I've been talking a lot about, more in general terms than specific to project management, but obviously it relates. And, it's really around kind of that risk management, right?
Yes.
So often I feel like risk is out of sight, out of mind. Let's not talk about nor test for all of the bad things that can happen. And, just the reality of it is, even if we want to take like the macro look, right? There's environmental issues continually ongoing. We don't know when the next kind of natural disaster is going to strike us. I just saw a couple of articles here recently about the flooding that is happening and the dam potentially breaking. Like, was that up in Minnesota or Wisconsin? And then even South Dakota, I saw a big article about some significant flooding. And again, sometimes these events are like 100-year events, right? Oh, that will never happen to us. And we're just talking about environmental considerations, not even, touching on all of the things that could go wrong internally within an organization. So that's kind of the setup for this next question. But, how do we approach risk from a PM standpoint, and kind of specifically around some of these digital transformation projects that you've been a part of? What kind of stuff have you seen? How do we plan for and, try to mitigate against the risks that are inherent with this, massive undertakings?
Yeah. So there's always, with the digital transformation, there's always risks that the work will not go smoothly, that the work will not be completed as efficiently, and that the project is delayed. So what happens if the project is delayed? What happens if a key personnel gets sick, leaves the company? Who knows what? Wins the lottery?
It's real.
It's real. It is real. I can give you examples of that. And then we also think about things like, what if there is an issue when the code is tested and we find bugs? What if integrating the new software with our existing records, our data is not as smooth as possible? What if our data is dirty? We have to clean up all of our data before we integrate it into the new software. That can take a long time because we don't want to put dirty data into the new system. And so that's one thing. And then you do, as a project manager, you do need a risk register. So what is the probability that this risk will occur? And then what is the impact? It does occur. So some things can be very low probability, but very high impact. And that is your 100-year flood example. So you need the input from all of your team to create that risk register. A PM cannot do that in a vacuum. You just, number one, you don't know all of the
Yeah.
risks, and you can't judge the probability and the impact on your own. You need the input of your team to do that. And then once you've identified those risks, you need to create some plan of how to manage it. Are you going to avoid the risk? Are you going to mitigate the risk? Are you going to defer the risk? What are you going to do about it? And that is a skill that a PM needs to create when they're working on something like a digital transformation project.
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges, back to the point of, not doing it in a vacuum and getting, obviously other stakeholders involved, is getting people to think about some of these, kind of 100-year flood examples, because again, so often, we have that in our mind, like, well, this could happen, but that's never going to happen. The likelihood, and again, having a tool like the risk register to not just keep track of things, but having relevant examples and again, getting people to kind of think a bit outside of the box, because back to your point, people win the lottery. I've seen people go out on FMLA for extended periods of time. I've seen people quit. I've seen people, I've seen it all, like you, I'm sure. And again, the larger the organization, the more complex the change event that we are managing and navigating, the more potential for these kind of oddities, if you will, low probability, high impact, scenarios to unfold. So, yeah, I love that. Shifting gears a bit out of the doom and gloom of, managing risk, and more kind of looking towards, the successful transformations. I'd love to know, do you have any great examples of kind of measuring the success of a digital transformation from the PM perspective? Because obviously this is, and again, depending on the size of the org, the size of the change, right? This is a very complex and dynamic thing that we're talking about. So how do we take a look at and ultimately measure success when we're navigating these risk events, when we're navigating, timelines being extended, when we're navigating all of these different things? And it's very difficult to say, hey, we crossed the finish line. Good job. So what do you say, to people that are asking about how do we measure success for this transformation?
So I want to step back for just a minute and say, in addition to having a risk register, the flip side of that is opportunity and capitalizing on opportunity. And so that's another thing. And that is part of the good news story that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And so we need to capture that as well. And that speaks to, crossing the finish line and completing the transformation. And one of the better examples that I can think of that I actually, participated in is a company that I worked for decided to create a contract management database. Basically, I'll just use that word now. But it had very robust, it had a lot of capabilities, and it reached across many departments, including my department. And so when it was originally announced that, hey, we're going to go to this new tool for managing our, there was a lot of grumbling and so forth, as you normally would expect to hear. And I was one of the early adopters, and I really liked the tool. It even had the ability to support our suppliers. So I took the training, saw how this was going to work. It was rolled out, and when I took the training, then I was identified as an ambassador for this new tool. And so I traveled to our facility in Dallas to conduct the training for our team in Dallas, and I taught them how to use the tool, the benefits of the tool, how it would relieve a lot of their more difficult challenges, and how it really brought the process of contract management and all the steps and approvals that were necessary into a tool where they could see everything, they could see the flow of the process, and I really liked it and apply. And then once training was rolled out, adoption of the new tool was one of the ways that we measured the success of the transformation to the new tool. And as an ambassador, I set up a weekly call, just an open invitation to my organization to say, okay, I'm here for Q&A. And it's just an open mic. If you have a question, and I began to keep a register of all of these questions. So it was like a lessons learned sort of thing. And oftentimes the questions would come and I'd say, I don't know, but I will find out. By next week's meeting, I will get an answer for you. And so that register became a resource that the whole organization could go to, because these became frequently asked questions. And that in itself became yet another measure of success, because eventually there were fewer and fewer people coming to the call, and we saw that the team was using the tool more efficiently. There were fewer errors. There were fewer calls to support. And eventually I disbanded the weekly call, and all of our reports on, how our teammates were using the tool, were they addressing their activities in a timely basis? Were our contracts meeting their compliance requirements? Yes. And those all of our KPIs were meeting expectations.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, what a smart way, to not just ensure a smooth rollout, but to engage people, actively engage people and kind of meet them where they're at, right? I think that's one of the biggest challenges that I see during any type of change event, significant as a digital transformation or something minor, just a process improvement, something very simple. But oftentimes we kind of overlook, I like to say, especially from the leadership level or the people that are kind of responsible to implement, right? Oftentimes we've been thinking about, dreaming about, obsessing over this thing for so long that it's so second nature to us. We think that everybody else just gets it through osmosis. and it's I find it's very non-intentional. We're not trying to do that, but we're just so consumed by it ourselves. And it's been so long that it kind of, we naturally feel as though it, other people are just going to get it. And so I love that example because it's taking that active role, it's meeting people where they're at, and it's addressing the underlying issue of why aren't more people adopting? It's because they're running into trouble with this thing. So how do we give them the support to get them over, the hurdle? So what a great example. And again, you're crushing these segues today, Angela, because this just goes right into my next question. And, what I want to talk about is, from that kind of change management, company culture perspective, how does a PM really support that, and how did they become kind of the conduit of
Right.
activities to support the long-term change, right? That is the ultimate goal, the adoption, the long-term sustainability of this particular change event that we're all navigating. So how does a PM kind of help build that bridge and support what's going on?
That's a great question, Dave. I think first, with your team on the project, they have to understand the why, the what's in it for me. Why are we even doing this? Because if they don't, they're not going to be engaged. They're just going to say, all right, I have to spend a few hours a week on this project. But if they do understand the greater reason for why we're even doing this, why is the company going down this road, then they'll be more committed, more motivated to complete their tasks and to the project. If they understand the benefits, not only to the company, oh, the company's going to make more money. Okay, yay, maybe I'll get a pizza party at the end of the project. That's not motivating. But if they understand that as a result of this digital transformation, the company will be positioned to win more business, which could lead to them getting a raise, or from a negative perspective, it will prevent the company from losing business or being debarred from bidding on certain projects. And they will not lose their job or be laid off. Then they will certainly be committed. We have to do this to remain compliant. We need to do this to be able to bid on this big project, or those are motivators. We need to do this to make certain changes to our products as to be competitive in the market because of evolving safety requirements, for example. Then that helps them better understand and want to continue with the project. And plus, it's just being transparent and building trust within the team. The project manager shouldn't hold that information close to their vest. They should be transparent with the team, and unless there's some compelling reason why they can't share information, then that type of information should be shared with the team. In fact, it should be a part of the project charter. Why are we doing this? Here's why. List all the reasons. Because that should be part of the business case. I think that for change management, the team needs to understand any of the changes that are brought forward, how they can be incorporated into the project plan. And change is always going to happen, whether it's changes in schedule, changes in requirements, hopefully not changes in funding, except if you're getting more. I want to hear about.
Does that happen?
Oh, yeah.
That's great. Yeah, it's again, it's a complex topic to navigate that generally can all be boiled down to, more effective communication. Mm-hmm. I think, what becomes challenging, especially the larger the organization, is to disseminate that, in an easily digestible way. Because these projects and these changes become so dynamic that even with kind of regular touch bases or updates or cadences, it becomes very challenging to navigate people's schedules and get, kind of everybody in one central place. So kind of defining some of those touch points and communication methods. And the other piece of advice, from my perspective is, no update is an update. Oftentimes when there is no progress, we just need to share that. And, too often it's the out of sight, out of mind. And people start to say like, oh, whatever happened with that? It's like, well, we're still doing it. Yeah. Oh, I hadn't heard anything. So I just figured we're not doing it anymore. Right. Like it's incredible that those types of, things are being said, but they happen pretty regularly. I'm sure that you've heard some similar things in your time.
Oh yeah. So I think that a good cadence for a project team is weekly or bi-weekly, and then an update to leadership once a month. And the project leader is a good cadence.
Yeah, that's great advice. Well, Angela, as we start to kind of wind this thing down, any final thoughts or insights that you want to share with the folks out there, kind of as it relates to project management and kind of digital transformation, digitization, and digitalization?
Good. So a digital transformation can have many moving parts. And a project manager needs to be aware of all of these parts, at one time. There could be different phases of the project, and it can have a large team, but definitely a lot of stakeholders. And each of those stakeholders are important. They have a voice, and it's up to the project manager to make certain that they feel or that they are heard, and that they receive the communications that they deserve. Now, the end users may not need to know all the intimate details of the project status, but they do need some communication. And so I would definitely recommend a RACI chart and let each one be identified. Do they just need to be informed at certain points of the project, and keep them up to date as is appropriate? And so that's another tool that a project manager on a digital transformation project might employ.
Love that. And for folks that aren't familiar with that acronym, what does that stand for?
Well, I knew you were going to ask that.
Well, I couldn't remember either. It's responsibilities. Here we go. I had to look it up quick. Responsible, okay. Accountable, consulted, and informed. So yeah, think about that as it's a very simple matrix tool, and it's all about identifying, key stakeholders and at what level of their involvement is, right? So, and I think I've got a tool somewhere out on the website I can link to in the podcast notes for folks if they want to see an example. So, Angela, go ahead. You had something to add?
There's just one thing. So throughout this conversation, we've been talking about these three topics: digitization, and digital transformation. And this comes from my blog article. So I'd be happy to share that with them.
Yeah, well, I'll make sure to link that in the show notes as well for people so they can check that out. Definitely want to read through that. It's a great blog post. So thanks for putting that together. For anybody that's out there that wants to connect with you directly, Angela, where's the best place for them to get a hold of you?
Either LinkedIn or through my website, which is thurmanco.com.
Perfect. And I'll make sure to put those links in the show notes as well. Angela, thanks so much for coming on the Everyday Business Problems podcast. It's always a pleasure having you, and I always appreciate you sharing your smarts and your insights. So thanks.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Crysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Crysler.